June 18th, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The smell hit us first warm, yeast-melting butter and flour dust drifting like morning snow. After 3 weeks of trains, trucks, and a ship that smelled of rust and vomit, none of us expected our senses to be ambushed by something so gentle. 24 of us stood frozen at the doorway of the mess hall, staring like children pressed against a bakery window. Fresh white bread, in America, and it was for us. I remember gripping the strap of my canvas bag so tightly my knuckles turned white. For months in Germany, bread had been a gray, dense, tasteless thing, if it existed at all. We sliced it thin as paper, hid crumbs for later fought stomach cramps in silence. Mothers stood in soup lines that never moved. Soldiers like us lived on watery stews and slogans about sacrifice. There was no smell left in German kitchens except scorched turnips and fear. But here, the air itself felt impossibly full. A Hobart industrial mixer churned in the back of the kitchen, humming like some great American engine of abundance. 2 American soldiers wearing aprons. Aprons, as if this were some farm country diner and not a prisoner of war camp, slid steaming loaves onto stainless steel trays that gleamed under the lights. The ceiling fan above us creaked rhythmically, stirring the heat and pushing the smell of baking bread right into our faces until my stomach twisted painfully. I wanted to step back. I wanted to run. Nothing in our training had prepared us for the enemy to greet us with the scent of home we had lost. Somewhere near the far wall, a GI boiled coffee in a dented metal pot, the aroma sharp and dark. I hadn't smelled real coffee since 1942. This was GI coffee. Rumors said Americans drank it constantly, black and bitter, but endless. The radio beside him crackled with war updates in English, then slipped into a bright, brassy swing tune. Glenn Miller. I had heard him once at a dance hall before everything in Germany collapsed into rubble and ration cards. Hearing it now felt like a punch to the chest. How could life still sound like that? How could music and war exist on the same frequency? A woman behind me whispered, "Das ist unmöglich." This is impossible. Impossible because Germany was starving, because cities were being bombed into dust, because the official newspapers insisted America was suffering from shortages so severe that their own families would soon be begging the government for bread, because propaganda told us Americans tortured prisoners, fed them scraps, treated them worse than cattle. But the mess hall before us looked nothing like the horrors we had been warned about. It looked like a place that never knew shortages, a place where ovens stayed hot because they could, a place where food was not fear, but routine. My throat tightened. I felt angry not at the Americans, but at myself because some small soft part of me wanted desperately to believe this was real. "Move along, ladies," one of the guards said, not unkindly. He gestured us forward with a tired motion as if we were simply another group of workers reporting for a shift. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing a tan earned under a sun that could melt bone. He smelled faintly of soap and machine oil, clean scents foreign to the war-ravaged edges of Europe. We stepped inside. Heat from the oven washed over us. I felt sweat prick beneath my uniform, but the warmth was comforting in a way I could not explain. The Hobart mixer clicked rhythmically. The ceiling fan tapped. The radio whined between frequencies. Everything in that room pulsed with life, with motion, with an ease so profoundly American that it made me dizzy. "Fresh batch in 5 minutes," the cook announced to no one in particular as he pulled another tray from the oven. He might as well have said he was pulling sunrise out of a box. He tapped one loaf with the back of his knuckle, nodded at the hollow sound, and set it aside to cool, not guarding it, not locking it away, just leaving it there unattended. As if bread grew wild here, as if it weren't the most precious thing in the world. I felt the others around me struggling to process the same impossible truth. We had come from a country where children fainted in schoolrooms, where old men pushed bicycles for miles to look for potatoes that didn't exist, where entire neighborhoods lined up just to buy stale flour. In some parts of Germany, people ate turnips for weeks. That winter had a name, the turnip winter, and here in front of my eyes were pans of soft white American bread glowing golden in the light. How was a prisoner supposed to understand that a guard walked past holding a clipboard, not even glancing at the food? He yawned. A yawn, as if this abundance were so normal he could barely stay awake through it. Another GI stirred the coffee with 2 fingers pressed to the rim of the pot, humming under his breath. They lived in a world where food was background noise, where bread was ordinary. My breath hitched. Ordinary. the one thing that had been extraordinary to us for years. I felt the thin fabric of my uniform cling to my ribs when I inhaled. I must have weighed little more than a child. Weeks of ocean crossings and rationing had carved hollows beneath my cheeks. My hands shook as I reached for the tray handed to me. The metal felt warm. Warm. Just like my mother's kitchen had felt before, the war took everything. Someone behind me whispered, "They must be showing off." But another voice said quietly, "Or maybe this is just how they live." How they live. Those 3 words frightened me more than anything else that morning. Because if they were true, if America really fed its prisoners like this, then everything we had been taught about them was wrong. And everything we had been taught about ourselves might be wrong too. I stepped closer to the bread, staring at the steam rising in soft curls. Around me, the mess hall buzzed with the casual symphony of an American morning spoon's clinking coffee, boiling Glen Miller, fading into static. It was so ordinary, so gentle, so shockingly human. And for the first time since the war began, I felt my certainty crumble. I should have turned and walked away. My body told me to my legs felt like stiff wires ready to snap, but I stood there paralyzed between hunger and the crushing certainty that none of this was real. No one gives fresh bread to the enemy. No one feeds prisoners better than soldiers. No one treats captives with warmth unless they want something in return. In Germany, we had a word for moments like this, Falle. A trap. And every instinct in me screamed that I had just stepped into one. The moment we entered the mess hall and the door swung shut behind us, the fear rose like a hand closing around my throat. The warmth, the smells, the shining trays. Everything that had stunned me only seconds earlier now felt threatening, mocking, too perfect, too generous, too easy. I had heard the stories whispered in our barracks during training. Americans starve prisoners. Americans torture to extract information. Americans feed you well at first, then take everything away to break your mind. Our instructors repeated these warnings with solemn faces as though describing an unchangeable law of nature. For years, I believed them completely. War makes you believe the worst because believing anything else feels foolish. But what I saw in that kitchen, it didn't match the darkness I had been taught to expect. And that contradiction terrified me more than brutality ever could. A German soldier can brace herself against cruelty, but kindness, especially kindness from the enemy, can unmake a person. I took a step toward the trays of bread, pretending to follow the others, but my eyes darted everywhere: the guards' hands, the corners of the room, the windows. I was looking for signs of deception, the hidden cruelty surely waiting behind the softness. A GI near the counter wiped flour from his forearm and said casually to his colleague, "Man, this smells just like my mom's Sunday biscuits." He laughed, a small, fond sound that made my chest tighten. How long had it been since I heard a person laugh without bitterness? His voice was warm, unguarded, and it terrified me. Sunday biscuits. What a strange thing to mention in a place like this, as though war could be paused, as though prisoners were simply guests. It made the soldiers seem human, and the Reich had taught us that Americans were anything but. I forced myself to look away. Then my eyes landed on something that made my breath stop: butter. Real butter. A full slab of it sat on a plate, pale yellow and soft at the edges. I hadn't seen real butter since 1941. In Germany, we used substitutes, grayish spreads made from whatever could be scavenged or powdered. Butter existed only in memory. Seeing it again felt like seeing a ghost of my old life, a life I no longer trusted. Beside the butter, a metal refrigeration unit buzzed, faintly cold air escaping each time a GI opened it. I stared at it, stunned. A machine that kept food cold day and night. In Europe, we barely had electricity after the bombings. Most of our meat spoiled before it reached the cities when there was meat at all. Here, the refrigerators hummed like it was nothing, like abundance was a natural state. That was when panic truly set in, not because America had more, but because America had too much. Germany was starving. Children fainted in classrooms. Families boiled potatoes until the water turned thin and gray. In some places, people ate turnips until they could no longer stand the smell. But in this camp, a camp for enemy prisoners' bread was produced by the armful butter, rested openly on trays. Refrigeration machines rattled with cold air, and American soldiers joked about biscuits. The contrast was so brutal, I felt ashamed to breathe their air. As the line moved, something inside me snapped into survival mode. Don't trust them. Don't rely on this food. Take what you can now. They will take it back later. The voice in my head sounded like the officers who trained us like the women I worked beside in Berlin, like every warning the Reich had ever drilled into us. So, when I reached the serving table and the GI placed 2 slices of warm white bread on my tray, I didn't eat. I didn't sit. I didn't even speak. Instead, I let my arms fall naturally at my sides, keeping the tray close to my body, and while the guards weren't watching, I slipped 1 slice inside the front of my uniform. It burned my skin slightly, but I didn't care. Warm bread meant calories. Calories meant staying alive 1 more day. When no one reacted, I grew bolder. Another slice into my sleeve. Another pressed against my stomach beneath the fabric. 1 tucked into the band of my underwear. 2 hidden in my coat lining. 1 jammed awkwardly under my arm. 8 in total, 8 small chances at survival. My heart hammered so loudly I felt certain the guards could hear it. I kept my face still, but inside terror gnawed at every nerve. If they searched me, if they caught me, if this kindness was indeed a facade and they had been watching, what would they do? Would they punish us, like the guards back home punished looters? Would they make an example of me? A hand touched my elbow. I flinched so violently the tray rattled. "Ma'am, you all right?" A soldier asked, brow furrowed in honest concern. Honest concern. That frightened me more than shouting would have. "Yes," I whispered, forcing my voice steady, even as crumbs shifted under my clothing. I stepped away before he could look closer. The longer I stood in that room, the more everything around me felt unreal, almost hostile in its gentleness. America was untouched by war. No bombers overhead. No air raid sirens. Factories running at full speed. Fields heavy with crops. Towns lit at night like stars on the ground. 12 million American men were fighting overseas, yet the country still had enough labor and machinery to produce more food, more supplies, and more comforts than our entire nation could dream of. And here we were, the daughters of a starving empire, standing in a dining hall, built for prisoners, surrounded by things our families hadn't seen in years. It felt like a trick of the gods, a punishment, or a lesson, or both. My stomach growled loudly. No one laughed. No one mocked me. In that moment, the fear sharpened into something desperate and feral. I wasn't afraid of Americans hurting me. I was afraid of them feeding me, because if they fed me, if they showed mercy, if they treated me like a human being, then everything I believed about the enemy would fall apart, and what would be left of me then, I clutched the bread hidden under my clothing, feeling its warmth fade against my skin, and wondered whether I had just committed a crime, or whether I had simply done the only thing a starving girl could do. Prepare for the day when kindness would vanish and the world would return to what I understood: hunger, deprivation, and cruelty. The bread weighed nothing, and yet inside my uniform it felt as heavy as the war itself. I should have kept walking. I should have stayed invisible, swallowed by the noise of trays and boots and clinking silverware. But fear makes your movements clumsy and desperation makes them reckless. When I adjusted my collar, a small piece of crust slipped from my sleeve and fell to the floor with an unforgiving tap. I froze. The room didn't. Forks scraped. Soldiers talked. The radio crackled a swing melody, but the closest American guard, the tall one with sandy hair and kindness in his eyes that I didn't trust, turned his head just enough to see the crumb at my feet, and the shape beneath my uniform. For one suspended heartbeat, I felt my entire world close in. Everything inside me screamed, "It's over. This is the moment they punish you." This is where the stories were right. I bent down slowly, trying to hide the trembling in my hands, but before I could touch the floor, a shadow fell over me. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you don't need to do that." I straightened, pulse roaring in my ears. He reached out, not grabbing, not threatening, just lifting his hand to stop me gently, the way a person stops a skittish animal from bolting. For a moment, the mess hall dimmed around me. His face stayed calm, patient. Then, he said the sentence that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "You don't need to hide it. There will be more tomorrow. Tomorrow, more." The words hit me harder than any blow could. I stared at him, unable to speak. My throat was tight, my lungs full of hot air I couldn't release. He wasn't accusing me. He wasn't angry. He sounded almost sympathetic. He glanced toward the large industrial oven behind him, still exhaling steam into the room. "We bake every morning," he added with a small smile. This is America, America. As if the word itself explained everything, the bread, the warmth, the gentleness. To him, maybe it did. The soldier crouched and picked up the fallen crumb, tossed it lightly into a nearby bin, and brushed his hands on his apron. He didn't demand I empty my uniform. He didn't call another guard. He didn't even lower his voice. He just stepped aside and nodded toward the seating area. Go ahead. Eat while it's warm. I couldn't move. Behind me, another GI approached with a dented metal pot. Coffee, he asked, lifting the lid. The smell curled into the air, dark, earthy, strong. He poured some into a tin cup and handed it to me like we were in a diner off Route 66 rather than a POW camp. His smile deepened the confusion tightening around my ribs. Nothing wakes you up like G.I. Joe, he said proudly. Kept me alive through basic training. Another soldier leaned over overhearing. You should have seen his face on day one, he said laughing. Thought the coffee was motor oil. The first GI nudged him with his elbow. Well, it ain't French, but it'll keep a man breathing. Their laughter seemed to belong to a different world, a world untouched by hunger, by rubble, by fear. I felt like an intruder in someone else's memory. Still trembling, I lifted the cup to my lips. The bitterness shocked me. Then the warmth spread through my chest. I hadn't felt warm from food in years. The kindness didn't stop there. Another soldier, a younger one with freckles and sunburned cheeks, approached our table holding a worn leather wallet. He didn't say anything at first, just silently offered me a small photograph he pulled from inside. A family stood in front of a weathered white farmhouse in Kansas. A woman in a floral dress, 2 children holding tin lunch pails, and next to them, a man leaning proudly against a Ford pickup truck shining in the sun. That's home, he said, tapping the image gently with his finger. Dad bought that 40 Ford with his own hands, every bolt paid off from wheat harvests. I looked at him, unable to understand why he was showing this to me. Maybe he saw the confusion in my face because he added, My mom, she feeds everyone. Neighbors, drifters, farmhands, even folks passing through during the Dust Bowl. Back home we feed everyone. He shrugged as if it were the simplest truth in the world. It's what we do. It's what we do. Those 4 words felt like a lantern in a long, dark cave. Around us, the mess hall hummed with the sounds of a nation at its peak, even inside a prison camp. Industrial ovens, refrigeration units, metal trays stacked in endless rows, bread cooling on racks, coffee pots steaming, soldiers moving with the relaxed confidence of men who knew their homeland was safe, strong, and overflowing with resources. I realized then that America wasn't performing kindness. It wasn't a trick. This abundance was simply normal to them. While Europe bled, fields burned steel. Factories shuttered and trains carried refugees instead of grain. America, in 1944, was feeding not just its own people, but entire Allied armies. Fields of wheat, corn stretching to the horizon, cattle ranches larger than German cities, factories that never slept. They could afford to feed prisoners more than we could feed our citizens. And somehow, that truth was more destabilizing than any act of cruelty. I felt the warmth of the bread still hidden beneath my clothes. 8 pieces. 8 insurance policies of fear. The tall soldier must have noticed the way I subconsciously touched my uniform because he stepped closer, lowering his voice. It's all right, he said. Take what you need. No one here's gonna hurt you. I wasn't sure if he meant it for me alone, or for all of us, a quiet promise spoken in a room full of former enemies. He didn't understand the magnitude of his words. He couldn't, but I did. Because Germany punished hunger. America forgave it. One of the women at my table, Marta, whispered in disbelief, Why aren't they angry? Why don't they stop us? I shook my head, unable to form an answer. The freckled soldier overheard her quiet panic and offered gently, Ma'am, this is a work camp. You'll get your meals regular as the sunrise. Regular as the sunrise. He said it with such certainty as though the world itself obeyed American schedules. Dinner that night was the moment everything inside me shifted. On the way out, the tall soldier held the door open for us, actually held it as if we were guests, not prisoners. The setting sun washed his face in gold and dust. You'll see, he said, almost as an afterthought. Tomorrow we'll have fresh bread again. He paused, then smiled a little. And the next day, and the next. I swallowed hard. I didn't know whether to believe him. I didn't know how to believe him. But for the first time, the fear inside me flickered, not dying, but bending like a flame in new wind. That night, lying in my bunk with the taste of coffee still lingering on my tongue, I finally understood what terrified me most about America. Not their power, not their armies, not their wealth, but their kindness offered without hesitation, without expectation, without fear. A kindness so casual it felt structural, as if compassion was woven into the machinery of the country itself. A kindness so abundant even an enemy could not be turned away from it. A kindness strong enough to survive war. As I drifted into uneasy sleep, I kept hearing the soldier's words repeated in my mind again and again. There will be more tomorrow. It sounded less like a promise about bread, and more like a promise about the world. The moment it happened was so small, so ordinary, no one noticed at first. A sliver of bread, hidden beneath my uniform since morning, finally slipped free during lunch and fell onto the wooden table with a soft, almost apologetic tap. But to me, it sounded like a gunshot. I froze. The women around me froze. And the tall American soldier, the same one who had said there will be more tomorrow, turned his head just slightly, the sunlight catching the edge of his jaw. It was that sunlight, golden and warm through the tall Texas windows, that undid me. It streamed in with an honesty that felt foreign, painting everything in a glow that did not belong to war. In its light, nothing could hide, not lies, not fear, and definitely not the trembling secret pressed against my ribs. The soldier stepped closer. Not hurried, not harsh, just curious. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you all right?" I wanted to answer. I wanted to stand tall to protect what little dignity hunger had not stolen from me. But the terror that had lived inside me for years. The ration lines, the empty pots, the sirens and ashes of Berlin rose like floodwater and drowned everything else. My voice cracked. The bread at my feet betrayed me fully. He followed my gaze, looked down, then back up at me. Something in his face softened. Not pity, understanding. And that was what broke me. Not cruelty, not punishment. Understanding. "Stand up, Ingrid," Marta whispered beside me, trying to help, but her voice shook too. We were all shaking. I forced myself to rise. My knees wobbled. The hidden bread shifted again beneath my clothing, warm against my cold skin. My throat closed. I could not breathe. The soldier stepped back, giving me space, another kindness I wasn't built to handle. It happened before I could stop it. Before pride could stop it. Before fear could contain it. I began to cry. Not silent tears. Not the quiet weeping we had learned to master in Germany when grief had to be hidden so the war effort would not be weakened. No, this was a cracking open, a sob torn from somewhere deep, primitive, exhausted. It escaped my chest with a sound I did not recognize as my own. My hands clutched the edge of the table as the room blurred into smeared gold from the dripping sunlight. I cried for the bread. I cried for the hunger. I cried for the years of believing that mercy was always a lie. I cried because I did not know how to live in a world where the enemy said eat instead of obey. Around me, one woman gasped, then another. Then the dam inside all of us burst at once. Ursula covered her mouth with both hands shaking violently. Brunhilde sank onto the bench, shoulders collapsing. Even stoic Marta's eyes filled until tears spilled onto her cheeks, carving pale streaks through the dust. We didn't cry like prisoners. We cried like people who had forgotten what safety felt like and were terrified to feel it again. The mess hall fell strangely quiet. Forks paused. Chairs stilled. The radio in the corner continued playing softly, a sweet, bright melody drifting through the tension. "Don't sit under the apple tree." It was almost insulting how cheerful the song was. A piece of America so innocent it felt like it came from another planet. The soldier watched us stunned into silence. His confidence faltered. His brow furrowed. He looked as though he had just walked into a room full of wounded animals and did not know which one to help first. Finally he spoke. "Ma'am, did someone hurt you?" The question hit me like a blow, because for the first time in years, the answer was no. "No," I sobbed, shaking my head, my hands clutching the nearest piece of bread as though it were life itself. "No one hurt me." He glanced at the fallen crumb, then at the bulge beneath my uniform. His voice dropped to a whisper. You don't need to hide food." I choked on a bitter, ugly laugh. "I do. You don't understand." I lifted shaking hands to show him the truth. The bread pressed into my skin. The fear pressed deeper. I thought, "You would stop feeding us." I swallowed hard. "I thought you would punish us if we ate too much. if we asked for more, if we survived too well. His face went still, completely still. Behind him, the other American soldiers exchanged looks. Confusion, sadness, guilt that wasn't theirs to carry. One removed his cap, running a hand through his hair. Another looked down at his boots, his jaw tight. They had grown up in a country where children had lunchboxes and school milk programs, where food was plentiful even during the Depression, where the idea of a government starving its own people was unthinkable. They had no frame of reference for Germany's empty shelves or for our fear of tomorrow. The tall soldier inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself. Then, very quietly, he said, "Ma'am, this is America. We don't starve prisoners. We never have." Something inside me shattered so completely that for a heartbeat I forgot how to stand. We don't starve prisoners. We never have. The words felt like they carried the weight of generations, a creed passed down from fathers who shared their last loaf during the Depression, mothers who fed strangers on the doorstep towns where barns were rebuilt after storms by neighbors who barely knew each other. It was the sound of a country certain of its goodness. And it broke me because I had never known a nation to speak like that. Sunlight stretched across the table, turning the crumbs into gold dust. Outside, Texas wind rustled the grass. Inside, Glenn Miller sang about apple trees and lovers and simplicity, a world where war did not exist. And in that glowing, impossible room, the war inside us, the distrust, the fear, the indoctrination crumbled faster than any bomb could make it fall. One of the Americans stepped forward, his voice thick. "My grandma always said, 'A hungry man can't be an enemy once he's been fed.' We all grew up hearing that." Another added softly, "Folks back home send us extra rations sometimes. They want us to share. They want to show the world what kind of people we are." I wiped my face with the trembling fingers. "But why us? We were your enemy." The tall soldier didn't hesitate. "War makes enemies," he said gently, "but hunger makes everyone the same." Something in the room shifted. Then something quiet but monumental. The Americans saw us not as prisoners, not as the enemy, but as young women who had been taught to fear what they did not know. They looked at us and realized the truth. Our desperation wasn't defiance, it was survival. And we looked at them and realized a different truth. Their kindness wasn't strategy, it was culture. The greatest generation wasn't great because they were strong. They were great because they were decent, when decency was the harder choice. The soldier crouched beside my bench, lowering himself until he was eye level with me. His voice softened to something almost tender. "You're safe here," he said, "and tomorrow there really will be more bread. More bread. The promise of a future." Outside, the war was still raging. Germany was collapsing. Hunger was swallowing entire cities. Fear ruled everything we had ever known. But inside that glowing Texas dining hall with sunlight warming our faces and Glenn Miller's cheerful melody floating through the air, the world felt impossibly gentle. I cried again, but this time the tears were different. Not fear, not shame, something closer to release. Something like hope. And as I looked around at my fellow prisoners, women who had carried so much dread into this land across the ocean, I realized they felt it too. This was not the prison we had been warned about. This was a country teaching us quietly and without pride that mercy did not weaken a nation. Mercy defined it, and in that moment, in the golden silence after my breakdown, a seed of truth planted itself inside me, a truth I would carry for the rest of my life. Kindness is stronger than propaganda, stronger than fear, stronger than war. The night after my breakdown, I lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep. Texas wind slipped through the cracks of the barracks walls, carrying the smell of dust and hay. The bread I had once hoarded now sat untouched beside my cot, not hidden, not clutched in panic, simply resting there like something that finally belonged to me. Sleep refused to come. My thoughts chased themselves in circles until I finally reached for my small, battered notebook, the only possession I'd carried from Germany that still felt like a piece of myself. I opened to a clean page lit only by moonlight leaking through the window, and wrote the first honest words I had trusted to paper since the war began. Strength is not in cruelty. It is in saying, "There will be more tomorrow." I stared at the sentence for a long time, tracing its shape with my finger. The Ingrid who boarded the ship to America would never have written it. The Ingrid who lived through ration lines and bombing nights would have scoffed. But here in this strange country so certain of its own decency, the words felt true, frighteningly true. The next morning that truth only deepened. From the moment we stepped into the yard, an unspoken shift hung between us and the American guards. They weren't softer, they had already been gentle. They weren't more distant, they had never been cold. But they watched us with a new understanding, as if seeing not prisoners but daughters of a country that had failed to keep them fed. The tall soldier nodded to me when we passed through the gate. "You sleep all right, ma'am?" I managed a small nod. The sunlight caught his smile, not triumphant, not patronizing, but quietly relieved. It was the kind of smile that made a person believe in tomorrow. Later that day during work detail, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: the way the Americans treated one another. It wasn't just politeness, it was a kind of easy camaraderie that felt baked into the bone of the country. A lanky GI dropped his pack and muttered, "Forgot my damn matches again." Without a pause, another soldier tossed him a cigarette and said, "Here, my brother back home sends me extras. Back home extras." Two concepts that in Germany had long since disappeared. Another time, a young soldier with thick glasses struggled to read a letter from home. The words blurred, and frustration creased his brow. Before he could blink away the emotion, his Sergeant Gruff sunburned boots caked in mud stepped beside him. "You want?" "I should read it for you, son." The younger man nodded. The sergeant cleared his throat and began reading slowly, reverently, as if handling something sacred. A letter. Just a letter, but the care they gave it felt like warmth itself. And on a nearby farm where we sometimes worked to ease Texas labor shortages, I watched 3 soldiers repair a tractor for a rancher who had lost his sons to the war. "We'll get her running for you, one," said his voice firm with promise. Army taught us to fix anything. He wasn't boasting, he wasn't angling for praise, he simply believed that helping others was part of what it meant to wear the uniform. Everywhere I looked, I saw the same pattern. Americans didn't save their kindness for the cameras or the officers. They lived it casually and constantly, like a muscle that never tired. I found myself writing again that evening. The Americans have enough food, but more than that, they have enough goodness, enough to give, enough to spare, enough for strangers, even for enemies. It frightened me how quickly their generosity had begun to feel real. A few days later, the camp received word from command, a bulletin reminding the guards of United States POW policy rooted in the Geneva Convention. I overheard the officers discussing it as we passed by. "Washington wants us to keep standards high," one captain said. "They want the Germans treated well." Another replied, "They do it so our boys get treated better in Europe." A third shook his head. "It's more than that. They want the world to see the difference between tyranny and democracy." That line struck me deeply. The difference between tyranny and democracy. I had never considered kindness a strategic choice. I had never imagined mercy as a form of power. Yet, here it was, America using decency the way Germany used fear. And somehow, decency felt stronger. Later, our interpreter confirmed something astounding. The U.S. government kept statistics. They tracked how many German POWs returned home with positive views of America, and the number was high. Very high. The idea seemed unreal. That a nation would care what its prisoners thought it defied every lecture we were given back home about the softness of democracies. Maybe softness wasn't weakness. Maybe softness was a kind of courage. Every evening after work, I found myself observing the Americans more closely. Not their uniforms, not their rifles, but the way they were with each other and with us. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the cicadas buzzed through the heat, I saw the tall soldier sitting on the steps of the infirmary, helping an older German prisoner translate a letter from Bavaria. He sounded out the German words awkwardly, even making the wrong chi sound that Germans tease foreigners about. But he tried. He tried because he believed the old man deserved dignity. Later that same day, I watched him carefully bandage the finger of a POW who had cut himself mending fences. He handled the injury with a gentleness that reminded me of the nurses back home, but none of them had treated enemy soldiers so kindly. This was something else, something different, something American. By the end of the week, I realized the truth. America didn't treat us well because they were naive. They treated us well because it proved who they were, and because they wanted us to see it. In my journal, I wrote, "They win every day not by force but by proving their values stronger than our fears. Their mercy crushes the lies we believed." It was my awakening, slow, painful, but inevitable. War had taught me that strength came from domination. America taught me that strength came from generosity. War taught me to distrust kindness. America taught me kindness could be a weapon not to harm, but to heal. War taught me enemies were monsters. America taught me enemies were humans starving for hope like anyone else. And as I watched the guards laugh, work, share, and care for one another, I felt something dangerous and incredible rise in my chest. I believed them. Years later, historians would write that American POW camps were the most humane in modern warfare. That thousands of German prisoners returned home with unexpected admiration for the United States. That kindness, not intimidation, had softened hearts that bombs never could. But I didn't need a historian to tell me that. I lived it. I breathed it. I broke within it. And as I lay in my bunk one quiet night listening to Glenn Miller drifting through the camp and watching the stars through a crack in the roof, I realized what my awakening truly was. America had not only fed my hunger. America had fed my understanding of what a nation could be. Not a perfect nation, not a flawless one, but a nation that chose mercy where others chose fear and became stronger for it. In my heart, a seed took root. The war might be decided by armies, but its meaning was being decided here in a Texas camp with bread, kindness, and the promise of tomorrow. If my awakening in Texas had begun with bread, it matured in the quiet spaces between work and meals, in the small, ordinary moments of camp life that revealed more about America than any flag speech or soldier ever could. The moment that stays with me came one hot afternoon when a crackling burst of static erupted from the barracks. I startled, thinking for a split second it might be an alarm, but instead I heard an American soldier groan loudly. "Ah, hell, the radio's dying again." He dragged the battered wooden radio outside, its wires exposed like veins. 3 other soldiers followed, carrying rolls of tape, a screwdriver, and unmatched determination. One held the antenna in place while another slapped duct tape across the back with a thump that echoed across the dusty yard. "It'll hold till Sunday," the tallest declared, marveled at how a nation could survive a global conflict and still have the energy to joke about dessert. To someone coming from a place of scarcity and suspicion, this lightness felt like magic. It was during one of these evenings, warm wind rustling across the prairie, the patched radio humming with weak music, that the tall soldier sat near me and said quietly, "You know, I think folks back home would be proud of how we're treating you." I didn't know how to respond. So he continued, "There's enough hate in the world. Somebody's got to show what America stands for." I looked at the men around him, sweaty, tired, covered in dust, patching radios and arguing about pie, and something inside my chest tightened painfully. Because for the first time I realized what my fear had prevented me from seeing. Their strength didn't come from victory. It came from character. This was the greatest generation, ordinary men who believed decency was a duty, not a luxury. Soldiers raised in communities where neighbor helped neighbor, not because it was easy, but because it was right. They weren't perfect, they weren't saints. But they were united in a way I had never witnessed, by purpose, by principle, by an unwavering belief in the goodness of their country. I wrote later, America felt like a country where people believed in tomorrow. Germany felt like a country terrified of it. Sometimes late at night, after the guards had returned to their quarters and the barracks dipped into silence, I thought about what America must look like now, beyond the fences, beyond the farms. A vast nation lit by hope instead of fear. People working together instead of fighting. A society that refused to let war turn them cruel. And I felt a sadness I could not name, because I knew even then that one day history would change. That all nations soften, fracture, argue, forget. The unity I witnessed might not survive forever. The optimism might fade. The decency might be challenged. But oh, what a beautiful thing it had been to witness a country at its moral height. A country that fed its prisoners. A country that believed kindness was victory. A country where the biggest argument of the day was whether apple pie tasted better than pecan. As I closed my journal each night, one thought echoed across the silent Texas plains like a prayer America once shined so brightly. And I was lucky enough to see the light, because it was kind. Not naive, not weak. Kind, intentionally, courageously, defiantly kind. It believed goodness could outlast hatred. It believed feeding prisoners was not generosity, but duty. It believed the measure of a nation was how it treated those who could give it nothing in return. That was America's true power. Not its factories, not its soldiers, not its wealth, It's decency. When I speak to American visitors today, tourists, students, soldiers, I tell them what I witnessed. They answered proudly. "No, it won't." Another countered. "It only needs to last through Glenn Miller III, said, grinning. Then they all laughed, a warm, unhurried sound that melted into the Texas heat. That was the first moment I understood something deeply. American. These men were at war thousands of miles from home, guarding the very people they used to fight. And yet their spirits felt untouched by bitterness. They patched radios with tape the same way they patched hope, easily, confidently, as if believing things would work out was simply part of the job. In the evenings after our work on nearby farms, the guards often talked among themselves. Not about battles, not about killing, but about home. One described a small town in Iowa where everybody knows everybody, where you couldn't walk down Main Street without someone offering pie or asking after your mother. Another boasted about the community homecoming planned for when the war ended, a parade he swore would be so long the local marching band would run out of breath before they reached the courthouse. A younger GI spoke lovingly of his family's victory garden rows of tomatoes, beans, and squash planted behind the barn because every American ought to grow something for the war effort. His pride wasn't loud. It was humble, steady, the way a farmer speaks about soil he trusts. Others discussed Liberty bonds they bought with their meager paychecks. Even prisoners get fed because of those bonds, one joked. His friend nudged him. "Hey now, that's America for you. We take care of everyone." They said it casually, as if taking care of everyone were simply the default setting of the nation. I had never lived in a place where kindness was expected, not exceptional. Sometimes they invited us to sit on the benches nearby while they worked on equipment. One day, the freckled soldier who'd shown me the photograph of his Kansas family fiddled with a broken pocket watch. He didn't speak at first, just concentrated as sunlight flickered across the gears. After a moment, he said, "Back home, if a man's barn burns down, neighbors show up before the smoke clears." He shrugged. "It's just how we are." Another soldier nodded in agreement. "My mom says America's best quality is that we believe in tomorrow." He chuckled. "Even when there ain't no reason to." That phrase lingered with me, believe in tomorrow. It was the perfect description of what I kept sensing, a country propelled not just by industry or abundance, but by optimism that felt built into its bones. I wrote in my journal that night, "America feels like a place built on the assumption that the world can be better." Germany taught me to brace for the worst. America teaches me to prepare for the best. As more days passed, I started to see patterns. Nothing in the camp was perfect, the heat was brutal, the work exhausting, the loss of home ever present. And yet, there was a quiet decency woven into the rhythm of life. No one complained about sharing their rations with us. No one spoke of revenge. No one treated us as less than human. And what struck me most, no one argued about politics. Not once. They argued about pie, apple or pecan, grandma's recipe or the mess halls. One guard insisted apple pie tastes like freedom, while another swore pecan pie could win the war on its own. Their eyes widen, their expressions soften, and sometimes they swallow hard because deep down they know what the story reveals. Their grandparents were remarkable. Not perfect, but profoundly, beautifully, morally strong. The greatest generation proved that power and mercy can live in the same hand, I tell them. And when they ask me what America stood for in my memories, I offer the simplest answer. You fed your enemies. That is your legacy. I know America has changed. I read the news. I hear the divisions, the anger, the questions about who the country is becoming. But when people ask me what I believe about America truly deeply, I return to that Texas camp in 1944. I remember bread that smelled like forgiveness. I remember sunlight that warmed fear into hope. I remember strangers who had every reason to hate me but chose humanity instead. And I say, the America I knew once lit the world. And it can shine that way again. Because kindness is not a resource that runs out. Because decency is not a relic of the past. Because a nation that once fed its enemies can always choose to feed tomorrow.